Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Weatherwise Farming for Livestock Health and Welfare. We'll just go through a few bits of housekeeping before we begin. The session is being recorded, as you'll have just heard, and the recording will be available on the NFFM website and our YouTube account for those who are unable to attend the session in person. As this is a webinar, audio and video have been disabled, but you still have the full use of the chat function and the Q&A box for the duration of the webinar. So please do post a little intro to yourselves and then post any questions in the Q&A box as and when you think of questions. We will have a Q&A session at the end and we'll aim to get through as many questions as possible. But if you want to upvote any of the questions that you see other people posing, please do, and then we'll know which questions to prioritise in our answers, just if we're under time constraints. But those are generally all of the kind of housekeeping bits. So I'll kind of move on to introducing our session. So we're increasingly seeing more frequent extremes in weather. So it's vital, therefore, that we can help to mitigate some of these weather impacts on our livestock who are having to cope with these extremes in weather. And one such measure that we can effectively implement on farm to reduce weather impacts is by using infield trees and hedgerows to provide shade and shelter. So in this session, led by our wonderful speaker, Dr. Lindsay Whistance, we'll be looking at why animals choose certain areas of the fields, from open pastures to hedgerows, shade or higher ground, and how the availability of browse varies by location and will influence their choice too. We'll unpack some of the trade-offs, stock mating, heat, cold and wet conditions, and show how simple changes to shade, shelter and browse opportunities can improve welfare and boost productivity. So without further ado, I'll be introducing our speaker, Lindsay. Lindsay has a background as a stockman and gained a PhD in animal behaviour and has been working in animal science research for 25 years. Her research interests include animal behaviour and welfare, human-animal relationships, and ecologically resilient systems which promote a life worth living for farm animals. Her current research includes investigating the role of trees in temperature regulation, body maintenance benefits, and the nutritional medicinal opportunities from browse, as well as methods of feeding and processing tree fodder. So, Lindsay, I'll hand over to you to start your presentation.
Thanks very much. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it, all that? Maybe I should
It is, yes, going through everything.
I might shorten that. Okay, thanks very much. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Is that right?
Yeah, we can see that.
Lovely. Yeah, okay, thanks. Okay, so I wanted to start talking about the weather, really. So we are more than a decade into climate change in terms of average temperatures reaching 1 degree or higher above pre-industrial period. But climate change and weather are different things. Although climate change is impacting weather patterns, they are still quite distinct things. And so when we look at what happened over the winter of 23-24, we can see that whilst the temperatures were higher than average, and we're talking about a 30-year period of average temperatures with which these temperatures are compared against. So we can see we're getting really quite warm temperatures, and particularly in the south of the UK. But at the same time, there's not much sunlight going on, and there's a great deal more rain. So the lived experience, these effective temperatures, will be somewhat lower than the ambient temperature. And the same thing is happening in the spring of 2024 as well. We've got warmer temperatures, but a lot less sunshine and a lot more rain, making those lived conditions for the animals harder than just having warmer temperatures. So I've done a bit of delving and having a look at average temperatures for the last few years, and I've taken a selection of these for the winter period. So you can see in the winter of 2018, the temperatures are average, so the colour is white, but there's a lot more sunshine, and some periods, some areas are drier and some areas a little bit wetter than the 30-year average at that point. Then if we leap ahead to the 2024 that I showed you on the first slide, you can see a very different story of warmer temperatures, a lot less sunshine, a lot more rain. And then again, in the winter 2025, we've got a drop in temperature, still not very much sunshine, but not very much rain either. If we then look at the spring last year, there was a very strong difference from the average. So we've got much warmer temperatures, a great deal more sunshine, but a lot less rain than average. So a very dry spring that year. And then moving into the summer last year, also very warm temperatures, higher than average levels of sunshine, but still not very much rain across the UK. This was also a summer where we had record-breaking weather patterns. 4 times over that year, we had periods where we reached 30 degrees and higher. However, if we look at a single month, so this is July 2025, we can see just how much those temperatures fluctuate across a single month. So these are daily maximum and minimum temperatures for the whole of the month, and again compared to that 30-year average between 1991 and 2020. You can see just how much the temperatures are fluctuating, and they're not just a lot hotter on some days, they're actually quite a lot colder on other days, making it quite difficult for animals to adapt and to maintain thermal comfort across individual days, never mind across months and years. A similar pattern we can see for January of this year. So whilst we've got some days that are considerably warmer, we've got other days that are considerably colder. And these can change from day to day as well. So we can see on the second row, the Saturday and the Sunday, one day colder, the next day warmer. So this makes it very hard for animals to maintain thermal comfort across the years. And I just popped in this slide to show how a single species can adapt to climates. So on the left-hand side, we've got the Arctic fox, and you can see a very dense coat, very short ears. So the ears are able to maintain blood flow. On the right-hand side, we've got very big ears on this fennec fox, which lives in the desert. So this is enables the animal to better exchange heat with the environment. And then we've got the red fox, which is more adapted to temperate conditions. And this is really where we find ourselves, and our farmed animals find themselves, in this temperate landscape where the conditions can change already quite a lot, but climate change is bringing weather patterns that have more extremes both ends as well, making it really difficult for the animals that we have, but also how we, as carers of these animals, if you like, help them to adapt to these changeable landscapes. There's quite a lot of work being done on genetic adaptations and genetic resilience, but the physiological limitations that they have when they're being faced with hot and cold makes this only one of many strategies, and perhaps not a particularly good one. And so it makes a lot of sense that we look towards the environment to help buffer these systems for the animals. And the trees can do this in many ways. The buffering can be both direct and indirect. And a few examples here of indirect buffering are the shading of grass. So we've got the cutting off of solar radiation, so helping the grasses stay green. And within this level as well, we've got the evapotranspirative moisture that's being captured by the canopy and keeping it at a level where it can be utilized by the grass, but also helps to cool the air down for the animals that are sheltering under these trees. On the flip side, in wintertime, these canopies can help keep the grass or the ground warmer, and the ground temperatures under tree canopies can be as warm as 6 degrees difference between that and the open landscape. So this then can help animals find food sources in the winter, but it can also give them a warmer place to lie down when they're out wintering. In terms of water, the presence of their roots can help infiltrate water, but it can also help with holding that water within the landscape. So it's helping to prevent runoff, but holding that water where it needs to be, helping to buffer that system for longer. And there's some recent evidence that indicates, at least with oak trees, that they are sharing their water with shorter growing pasture plants. So actually redistributing the water under drought conditions. And of course, because we are all mindful of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, there's some promising evidence that looks at silvopasture as the most likely to harvest the greatest amounts of carbon across all different farming systems. So the carbon is a direct capturing. Ammonia is also captured directly by the canopy, but there's also indirect benefits capturing nitrous oxide and methane through the feeding of tree fodder to animals. So if we look at the animals more directly, when I talk about animal welfare, I really mean these three elements. They make the whole animal, if you like. So we should be looking at their physiological health, of course. Are they able to function biologically as that animal? But are they also able to behave socially and normally as that animal would in their natural environment? So these are the three things that constitute animal welfare in its entirety. So if we focus first on social relationships, most of the research here has been done on cattle. And we find that with cattle, they are more likely to maintain stronger social harmony when they're amongst the trees compared to when they're out on open pasture. If we look at their behaviour, well, there's a whole repertoire of behaviour that's quite normal for cattle. And aggression is part of that because they are a hierarchical species and they attain their position through some dominance behaviour. But what we find when they're among trees is that they're more likely to show positive social interactions. And here, amongst the trees, their positive interactions are around 80% of all of their behaviour, compared to on open pasture, it almost flips, and aggression is the dominant behaviour pattern. There's some evidence also with poultry that they are less fearful amongst the trees. And we can see that. We often talk about fight and flight, but we forget the third behaviour here, which is freeze. And poultry show this behaviour. So it's effectively playing dead. And researchers found that although they still show this response, they recover much quicker when they're under tree canopy compared to when they are on open land. So these calmer animals also mean that they're calmer with humans. So there's some evidence from Brazil that human-animal relationships are better in silvopastoral conditions. And this is at least partly attributed to the animals having something concrete to hide behind. Physical, I should say, not concrete. So a second benefit that the trees bring into the landscape, and it's also related to thermal comfort, is the ability to rub and show body care. So they can get rid of dead hair, dust, dead skin, and all of these things help the coat and the skin to function optimally, which then helps them to manage their thermal comfort. And this is particularly important for our animals in the temperate climate. For example, our Bos Taurus cattle aren't that good at sweating. They can sweat, but their sweat glands don't function as well as the Bos indicus animals. So already they're not that good. And if you have then a dirty coat, it's going to limit how well they function. So it becomes increasingly important that the skin and the coat is kept clean. At the same time as they're removing all of this dirt and dust and dead hair, they're also removing external parasites. And there's good evidence that cattle that have trees to rub on have fewer ticks on their bodies than those that don't have anywhere to rub. And I was talking to a farmer a few years ago about his sheep. And when his sheep are in a field where they've got something to rub on, he gets many fewer sheep cast. So he's not having to go in and write them up again. I think one more thing to say about emotional welfare here is that when an animal is being rubbed, then their heart rate goes down. And this is a similar thing to when an animal is licking another animal, that the animal who is being licked, their heart rate goes down in a similar way. So there's a real emotional welfare benefit from not just the outcomes of doing this, but also pleasure in having it done. So I mentioned thermal comfort, and this is really what's happening in terms of heat generation and heat management. So if we think of animals that are generating heat, this is really a very neat system because our thermal comfort, our generation of heat, is all managed using waste heat from metabolic processes. So it's a very low cost, low energy process, keeping this animal in thermal comfort. So you'll see in the middle of this graph that there are two lines which denote the upper and lower end of thermal neutrality. So this is where metabolic rates are low or minimal, and they're denoted as the lower critical temperature and the upper critical temperature. Beyond these 2 points, the animal is no longer able to maintain these low metabolic rates. If it gets too hot or too cold, it then actively has to employ other mechanisms. So, for example, if it's too cold, it will start to lift up the coat, trying to trap hot air in, and it will try to eat more, so generating more metabolic heat through digesting of that food. The opposite happens when the animal is too hot. So it's already can't get rid of this metabolic heat. So it stops eating in an effort not to generate even more metabolic heat. And then, of course, sweating and panting and those kinds of behaviors come into play. If it continues to get too hot or too cold, these mechanisms stop functioning and they ultimately end in the animal's death. But let's go back inside the thermoneutral zone and let's see what's happening at the edges here. So before they reach their lower critical temperature or upper critical temperature, there's a moment beyond which thermal comfort is being compromised. And this is where the animal starts to change its behavior. So they're trying to maintain this low metabolic pressure. And the simplest thing for them to do is to go and look for an environment where they can better maintain that. So here, if the animal is too hot, they would be looking for shade. And where it's too cold, they would be looking for shelter. And typically trees are one of the fundamental elements in the landscape that can provide this for the animals. So if we have a look at cold stress first, again, most of the research here has been done on young animals and particularly on lambs. So there's a little bit about dairy calves, but most of this is about lamb survival and lamb survival outdoors. If we put shelter into the landscape, evidence shows that around about 30% of deaths can be saved. So the dominant cause of death in sheep, in lambs, is hypothermia and starvation combined. And it's difficult to separate those two things, because typically if a lamb doesn't get up to drink that first milk, then it dies. But it's worth noting that the lamb is cold and wet when it's born, and it relies very heavily on its mother to dry it before it stands up and gets that first milk. It's got no option to generate any heat. It's got very few reserves, so it can't generate any heat to keep itself warm. And during that first half hour of life, it can lose up to 10 degrees of its body heat. So if it's in a very cold and wet place, and it might be the third lamb in triplets, its chances of surviving are increasingly lower. And so putting that buffering in, that of wind and rain, becomes very important for its survival. A further benefit of having the sheep in amongst shelter is that it helps improve the ewe-lamb bond. And evidence shows that if the animals have been managed in shelter, and we're talking about 1 day for optimum bonding between a ewe and a single lamb, and up to 3 days for optimal bonding with triplets. So if you can keep them in that shelter for that length of time, then evidence shows that lamb survival at weaning is also increased. So you get a double benefit of survival for lambs by keeping them in shelter in those early days. And then, of course, as the lambs get older, then they start to show different behavior patterns to the ewe. Their time budgets are different. The ewe needs to go and feed and graze. The lamb needs to rest. And so you'll find that the lambs will then utilize shelter more than the ewes do as they get a bit older. Of course, it makes sense when we look at energy consumption. If they're using energy to maintain body heat, then they're not using it to grow. And there's plenty of research out there that shows that when young stock are in thermal comfort, then they grow faster and quicker on the same amount of feed. So I put this image in not because it's from the UK. It's actually from Nebraska. This is appalling welfare. I'm not even going to pretend it's not. You know, there's a reason why bison look the way they do when they live in these plains, but these cattle are not adapted to these cold conditions. And although we're not likely to see animals under these conditions, you know, we still are getting those cold points, and increasingly likely to get really bad storms. And I refer back to the winter of 2017-18, where we had 2 storms come through. So we had both the Beast from the east and Storm Emma coming through at fairly close together. And across the UK, we lost over 500,000 animals in those storms. So we're certainly not out of the woods in terms of protecting animals in winter weather. There's a lot of talk about planting new trees for many good reasons, but it's worth remembering just how many trees already exist in the landscape, and whether these trees can be useful in terms of managing animals and their welfare. So these are fairly similar images, but one's from Scotland and one's from Wales, and both different farmers use these stands of commercial trees for sheltering their animals, particularly in winter. So the one on the left-hand side is predominantly for sheep, and this farmer noticed that when his ewes were in this field, he was feeding them less and they were doing better throughout the winter period. And so these trees are no longer commercial. Their job is to protect the ewes throughout the winter. As the farmer became more aware of the value of the trees, he then planted this field at the bottom. So he devised these strips, and the intention of this field is to offer shelter for the lambs, but also offer shelter for the grass, offering a growing early grass for the ewes to graze on and provide milk for the lambs. And this system has been so successful for the farmer that he's been able to upgrade his breed of sheep in terms of profitability. So he's moved away from black faces to clean, and he's able to cross his ewes with a more commercial tup. So he's making more money on less and with better welfare for his livestock. The other image is, as I said, it's from Wales, and this particular farmer, he's still using the trees commercially, but when he fences them off, he's putting stiles in. So if any storm weather is coming through, he opens the stile, and then the animals can go in and shelter against the storms. So we talk a lot about heat stress, and we try to get a handle on what heat stress is. So traditionally, we've used the THI score, which is the temperature humidity score. Now, there are lots of these different scores for different animals, but effectively, it's working out, calculating what the heat stress is to the animal, only using the temperature and the humidity measures. The challenge with this is that historically, they don't consider the animal, but they consider the outcomes on productivity. And so it's rather a clunky measure of heat stress, but it is a cheap measure because you're not having to go out and assess the animals. So it persists. Other measures of heat stress have tried to be more inclusive, if you like. So ETIC is a fairly modern measure of heat stress. So this is called the equivalent temperature index for dairy cattle. And what they've done here is they've included more weather measures. So they've got wind speed and they've got precipitation in this as well. And they've included measures of the animal. So you've got core temperature and skin temperature and respiration rate. What they're finding is that, and it's no surprise, that the animals are responding to heat stress much sooner than with the classic THI score. So there's evidence here that dairy cows are responding to heat stress already at around 18 degrees. But of course, here, if you think back to the image of the thermoneutral zone, this 18 degrees is at the beginning of the heat stress. So this is where they may still be in at the edges of the thermoneutral zone, but they're starting to shift their behavior. So they're responding to the weather conditions, but trying to maintain this thermoneutral behavior. So we know, of course, that animals can recover from mild heat stress, and this typically happens during the nighttime, currently when temperatures are going down. One of the challenges as we move towards a more rapidly changing climate is that this nighttime cooling is predicted to disappear. What this means for the animals, we don't yet know. But even if they're mildly heat stressed during the day, there will be some negative consequences. And typically, work here has been done on dairy cows, and that typically translates as a drop in milk. So they're starting to eat less already in these mild heat stress conditions, trying to manage their metabolic load. And that then translates into fewer litres a day. And even with mild heat stress, researchers recorded 5 litres drop in milk for every day of heat stress that the animals are experiencing. As the level of heat stress increases, then the consequences to the animal increase also. So you might see panting, so their respiratory rate is going up. Their stress hormones are increasing because they're increasingly becoming stressed by the conditions that they're living in. Talked about food intake going down to stop producing that metabolic heat load. And when food is not going through the gut, that disturbs the rumen microbes and also starts to increase metabolic disorders. At the same time that they're not eating to try to reduce metabolic heat, they're also closing down the gut, because if you like, they're starting to go into survival mode. So things that are not pertinent to immediate survival are being closed down. And while this is happening, the blood that's servicing the gut starts to be moved out towards the skin. So it's being circulated to try to attempt to reduce internal body heat. And the removal of this blood from the gut means that then becomes a permeable system where otherwise it should be impermeable. And when this happens, the toxins that are quite natural within the gut are starting to move into the bloodstream. And this then causes an inflammation cascade. So you start to see the diseases happening. So you'll see more lameness, and research done in Italy shows a lot more mastitis in dairy cows that are suffering from heat stress than those that aren't. So in closing down these non-critical parts of the body, this also means the reproductive tract. So they're showing less estrus expression if they're in calf. I say in calf because, again, most of this research has been done on cattle. Then embryo growth is disrupted, and further fetal development also becomes disrupted. Typically, calves born to these heat-stressed cows will be smaller, and the cow herself is producing less milk and colostrum, which is of poorer quality. So there's quite a lot of negative things going on in this moment. Now, the bad news doesn't end there for the calf, because whilst they're smaller, their organ sizes are also smaller. And the window of passive immunity also gets shortened. So we know that the gut is more open to receive these big proteins, these immunoglobulins from the cow, which enables this passive transfer of immunity. But this window typically ends after about 24 hours, and it ends with the death of these cells. So they just get replaced with normal gut cells after this time. Tragically, for these calves, the death of these cells is already happening before they're born. So not only are they smaller and their mums have poorer quality milk and colostrum, the window of passive transfer is also shorter. So it's really no surprise that for these calves, the cull rates are higher, mortality rates are higher. And we can see the negative things, all these negative points carrying on through the generations, and they're still measurable in the third generation. So the negative effects are for the cow, for the calf, and for the industry itself. And in the US, they've calculated the costs of all of these negative consequences to be around $1 billion on an annual basis for dairy cows, and then around $400 million for the beef industry. And of course, as the globe heats up, these costs will only get greater. So we come back again to buffering the system, and trees as a mechanism for buffering that system. And the good news is that trees can lower body temperatures noticeably than when there is no canopy present. And some work done, although it was feedlot animals, looking at animals that were finishing in feedlots with and without shelter. The animals that had the shelter were finishing 3 weeks earlier than animals with no shelter. So the evidence on productivity is very clear. The function in the animal is very clear. So when we put trees into the landscape, the animals utilize the pasture better, they utilize the environment better, and they're more able to maintain their normal behavior patterns. And that includes feeding and their productivity. Also a good knock-on effect of well-designed silvipastoral systems, this is to they use the landscape more evenly, and they're less inclined to leave all the nutrients in one place. So you can see here a single tree in a field where the cattle have been camping under this one tree and very clearly leaving all the muck in that one place. So I borrowed this from a piece of research that was done last year in Wales by Farming Connect. And on this particular dairy farm, they had sensors on the cows, and they were looking at milk yield, but also heat stress under different conditions. So these 3 bars are different levels of heat stress, and you can see again that they are different levels. So the mild heat stress here is considered to be between 20 degrees and just under 25 degrees. Moderate heat stress is measured to be 25 to 29 degrees, and then severe heat stress above that temperature. So these are the summer months from May to October last year. And look at the difference that having shade, so where the trees are, and the temperature and the consequence to heat stress experienced by the animals. So where the animals have shade from the tree, when you get into June and July, a little bit in August, you can see 4 little peaks of mild heat stress. But without those trees present, then the animals are beyond moderate and into severe heat stress in that time. Looking at the yields of the animals, they calculated how much money was lost to the herd in these different scenarios. And where the animals had shade from the trees, the average loss of the herd over that year was calculated to be £2,500, around that amount of money. But where there was full sun and up to severe heat stress, the loss for the herd was calculated to be around £35,000. So it's a really considerable amount of money that's lost. But of course, all of this is based on animals in stress. And perhaps it's worth considering here the trade-offs, potential trade-offs between loss of grass and loss of milk as a consequence of heat stress. So if we shift our attention a little bit to trees as fodder, I won't spend too much time on this, but of course, if we're putting trees in the landscape to help with shade and shelter, it also means that they can be available there as fodder. And all of our stock are browsers, from poultry upwards. All of them engage with trees and eat trees to a degree. So this is some work that was done by the forestry government in Scotland, where they looked at the annual intake of browse across our different species. So for cattle, they're taking on average around 12% of their total diet across the year as browse. For sheep, that's 20%. For goats, it's 60%. But there are times when this can increase quite dramatically. So cattle, it can be over half of their diet, and for goats, nearly up all of the diet as browse. This might be, for example, when there's very little grass in the summer, or when there are really tasty spring shoots available to them. If we think about Neolithic farming, then cattle were actually predominantly fed on browse anyway, because they would have been kept close to home. It would have been a very treed landscape with very little grass at this point. If there was any clearing done, then that would be for arable purposes. So the tree fodder would have been carried home. And if you look at those old tools, they actually demonstrate that tree fodder was the dominant fodder for cattle also at that time. There's and they look very similar to tools that we actually still have nowadays. So this is a piece of research that was carried out actually at the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't published until 1989, but it was around about 1912 or something like that. And this is real tree fodder that was used in Sweden. So they did this analysis, then compared it to the meadow hay and the red clover that they were growing for their stock. And the tree fodder compares very well in terms of fat, sugar, and protein. Now, of course, these are crude levels, so we're not considering here what's available to the animal, but as crude levels, they are demonstrating that they compare very well to the same to grasses grown in the same landscape. So a little bit more up-to-date research. So this was done in 2021 across 3 sites and 2 seasons with tree species to look to see what the differences were related to species, site and season. And so I've got crude protein and metabolizable energy. Again, we're looking at crude protein, but we're comparing here the levels of nutrients with the needs of growing lambs. And you can see that they actually function really well as fodder. So we're not remotely suggesting that they should be replacing grass, but as supplementary fodder, they can have an important place or part to play. Notice with the protein that it's going down across the months. So from June to September, the protein drops in all of the sites and all of the species. The story is a little bit different when we look at the minerals, and I'll show that in a couple of slides. But just wanted to show when the trees are analysed in terms of the nitrogen that's available to them. So if we look at crude protein and then how much of that protein is available to them, and again compare it to normal fodder, so here alfalfa and ryegrass, you can see quite a few of the trees compare very well. Although they might have higher levels of protein in them, less of that is available to the animal. But overall, they compare quite well to alfalfa and ryegrass. The standout is mulberry. This is a low tannin tree with good protein. And if you can grow it, it grows very well. So there are places in France where they actively grow this as a tree fodder, and they're harvesting tons over the year. The good thing about the presence of tannins, whilst they are an anti-nutritional factor, if you can keep that to around about 1 to 4% of total dry matter, then there are certain benefits to be had from their presence in the diet. Because they bind to proteins, they prevent them from being digested in the rumen, but when they reach the more acidic abomasum, those bonds are broken down, and that means that they're effectively delivering high quality rumen bypass protein. So the quality of the protein is increased by their presence in the diet. And they also have this beneficial effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And here we're talking about methane and nitrous oxide, noticeably reducing the levels of emissions when they're in the diet. So I said about the minerals from the earlier piece of research, and I've pulled these out. We had a lot more minerals in the list, but I pulled these out because I wanted to note that one of the major interests of this piece of research was trying to find a source of cobalt for lambs as they're being weaned. So they're losing that source of cobalt from the milk, but the amount of cobalt in the pasture is also going down at the same time. So how do you supplement them? Well, it turns out the goat willow is pretty good. And the value of looking to trees for this is that we're then not mining and utilizing finite resources across the globe. So building these resources back into the landscape and where the animals can utilize them themselves. So there are some different stories going on here. We know zinc also is very high in willow, all types of willow. So I've popped that one in as well. But then I've also illustrated other things that are happening. So these two, the cobalt and the zinc, illustrate a species difference. But with the selenium, for example, there was a clear site difference that although they were quite variable across the seasons, so they can be both higher and lower in certain trees, it was very clear that site 1 had more selenium available to the trees. The different story with iodine, across the board, there was more iodine in the later sample compared to the earlier sample. So here an example of the season. Overall, species was the most important measure, and then site was the second important measure for the availability of minerals. A further piece of research that we did was looking at how they store over time. And in this particular example, the samples were stored for 9 months overall. They were analysed when they were first harvested, and then they were analysed again after 9 months. What we found with this piece of work was that whilst other nutrients were degrading over this time, the minerals were very stable, really illustrating that they have a great value in fodder landscape, if you like. Now, I've highlighted 2 components for the goat willow in red, because I want to just note here that the phosphorus and calcium, so, we need a 2-to-1 relationship, balancing, if you like, for these. And that is pretty much what's happening in this particular sample. And then look at the image on the top left-hand side where you've got a steer with a dead rabbit in its mouth. So we know that animals will look for nutrients when they're short of them. This animal is kept on moorland, where it's poor in certain minerals and calcium and phosphorus among them. And it's driven to go and look for a source of these minerals. Now, there's quite a lot of research done on this over a few countries, and logically the animal doesn't know to go and look for a rabbit, a dead rabbit or a dead animal. This is abnormal behavior, but it's driven to go and find these minerals. So it keeps trying and it keeps trying and keeps trying until it finds something. And here it's learned that eating bones is a solution. But if we want to keep these animals functioning well and not being driven to show such abnormal behavior, then I would suggest that just having a few goat willows in this landscape might be a kinder option overall. So this page particularly is about plant secondary metabolites as much as nutrients. So I've covered the condensed tannins in terms of their benefits for protein quality, but they also bring benefits for anthelmintic management. And not the same tannins, they're all condensed tannins, but these are slightly different tannins. And they're sort of doing a similar thing in that they're kind of sticky molecules and they're attaching themselves to the worms. And by attaching them, they're preventing them from maturing. So those that do mature, there are fewer of them mature, and those that do become mature are much smaller. And because they're smaller, they're producing fewer eggs. So it's having a beneficial effect, if you like, on the next generation. Now, we know that condensed tannins are not as effective as chemical-based anthelmintics. We know this. However, two things in the favour of tannins are that there's no evidence that there's any resistance to them over time. Throughout evolutionary history, there's no evidence of any resistance from the parasites. And also, if you put them into the landscape, then the animals can manage their worm burdens over time without getting to a point where they have such a heavy burden that they need to be treated with chemical anthelmintics. So a piece of research done with sheep with heavy parasite burdens showed that when they were given access to tannin-rich plants, they reduced their worm burdens by 50%. And they also seek out these plants, going back to the animal with the rabbit in its mouth. When they have these heavy worm burdens, they start to seek out these tannin-rich plants. And again, research has shown that if you then treat them with chemical anthelmintics, then they start to go back to their preferred plant. So the drivers to eat those tannins is no longer there, and they revert back to their normal behaviours. Plant secondary metabolites is a huge, huge group of chemicals that the plants have. Luckily for us, we gain benefits from these. So the condensed tannins are some, and the salicylic acids are also another group that we benefit from, we collectively as a group. So we know these salicylic acids, when they're broken down in the body, they are metabolized into salicin, and then they offer the body pain relief, but they're also antimicrobial, antifungal, anti-inflammatory, and they also help to manage fever. Most plants have salicylic acid in them, but willow has become fairly synonymous with this. Some of them are high, certainly. The European violet willow is very high. Goat willow also scores fairly well. If you've got meadowsweet in the landscape, that is also a very good source of salicins. The easiest thing to do is to put trees back in the landscape so the animals can self-administer. So knowing what their browse heights are is useful in that regard. So we've got 2 meters height for the cattle, 1.2 meters for the sheep. And given that goats are fairly agile, there's no upper limit set for goats. If they can climb it, they'll eat it pretty much. But some of the challenges can be that typically there are more animals than there are trees in the landscape, so there might be some need to manage that. A rule of thumb is not to allow more than 50% defoliation of any tree, because if it goes above that, then we start to inhibit the full recovery of the tree. Of course, that's not the same for every tree, because some of them are very fast growing, and you can cut them right down, for example, when we're coppicing, and they will recover very well from that. But nevertheless, it's a rule of thumb, that 50%. And if you want to extend browsing or give the animals access to browsing that they otherwise physically can't reach, or extend that further into the season, then you can do cut and drop fresh. So the top left-hand corner is a very well-established silvopastoral system where the branches are being harvested for fuel, but they're being dropped in the middle of the season so the animals can gain benefit from the browsing. You might cut and carry fresh. So if you've got animals close to home, this is typically useful where you've got very few animals. So it's not too burdensome to carry too much home. And then, of course, we can start thinking about preserving. So tree hay is the classic method of preserving tree fodder. So simply drying it. This has happened since Neolithic times. It pretty much dropped off a cliff when we started to grow root crops. but it's starting to gain interest again now, and farmers are increasingly trying this. This is an image of a dairy goat farmer in Belgium who creates tree fodder every year for his dairy goats. Silage is also becoming more interesting, and much research is being done on that. A little bit here in the UK, but predominantly in Denmark, where the focus is mostly on providing willow silage for pigs. But they're getting very good results with that. I'm very mindful that a lot of the research currently is being done on willow for lots of reasons. The way that willow is grown, so typically in these short rotation coppices for biofuel, the industry is kind of set up for willow, and there are a lot of things to recommend willow. But if we think historically, our dominant fodder trees were wych elm and ash, and that's across the board. We look right back from Neolithic times. These were the two trees that were most highly prized as fodder trees. And willow has a mixed reception. Historically, at least, it was considered to be quite a poor tree alongside alder. However, if we're just looking at feeding a single plant, then there are very few plants that will fulfill nutritional requirements. So keeping willow in the mix and keeping the repertoire of food, if you like, it becomes increasingly important. Yeah. Yeah, so that's really what I wanted to talk about. And then hopefully there's some questions and some time for maybe looking at some of the issues and problems.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lindsay. That was really, really interesting. There's a lot to kind of unpack there, isn't there, in many different strands, all the way from kind of emotional behavioral changes all the way through to, yeah, the kind of actual cost benefits to putting trees back into the landscapes as well. We've got a raised hand from Ian, so I might see if I can actually let him speak if he wants to ask a question out loud, or if he would prefer to put it in the chat, Ian, that's also, you're very able to do that too, but I'll allow you to talk and then you can ask your question.
I think you have to unmute yourself, Ian, if you want to talk.
Maybe while waiting for Ian to either unmute or type his question out, I can just crack on with a question that I had, which was really around offering advice to our audience around kind of planning where to plant trees, and thinking about reinstating hedgerows, and what are some of the considerations that you talked a little bit on species there, and that willow is a good kind of all-rounder, but thinking about what other kind of practical considerations there might be in terms of planning where to put your trees.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, isn't it? And I think over time, I've started to think more and more about, rather than just these overarching rules, if you like, come down to the farm level and really think about what the flow of a farm is, how fields are used. If let's say, for example, it's a beef farm and there's a rhythm. So you know the rhythm of your farm. Typically when you've got animals, there are preferred fields for certain things. And it might be that calving and lambing closer to home for ease of monitoring. And when we start to think about these rhythms, there's also the seasons that go with these rhythms, and what might be needed where and why. So thinking about these things, if it's a farm close to home and you've got lambing and calving, then shelter against the wind, becomes a pretty good reason to plant trees. So it might be, in this instance, it might be that you're designing a shelter belt. Um, and then you need to kind of understand properties of the shelter that you get from a shelter belt. And of course, shelter belt hedgerow slash hedgerow, they're similar thing. But what you need to be thinking about here then is really four components. So you want a sloping profile. So you want to be lifting that wind smoothly up and over. You want some porosity in it. So you actually do want some wind going through, but you want to slow it down. So 50% porosity is considered to be the ideal. So you've got half of the wind going through slowly, half of it being lifted up gently. And by doing that, you minimize the turbulence. And then your third component is height. So the higher the shelter belt is, the higher that wind is being sent up, and the longer it takes for it to come down. So you're extending your optimal shelter much further into the field. And there are a few different measures, but the most consistent one that's cited is that the distance of shelter you achieve is 20 times the height of your shelter belt. So you can really make a big impact on the lived experience in that field. And then the fourth component is length, because at every cut you will create turbulence. So the shorter your shelter belt is, the less shelter you get for your hedge, if you like. So those are the four things to think about. And then when you've sorted out the shelter, the other thing to think about, of course, is that you've got mums that are in a state where inflammation is part of this process of lambing and calving. They need to recover. So they've got internal bruising, inflammation, swelling, all these kinds of things going on. So getting that pain medicine into the landscape as well. So having a little bit of a browse bar. Yeah. And goat willow, it's not a bad thing there. So, thinking about these things and starting to see the flow and the rhythm of the farm can start to identify, for example, if you've got dairy cows, and you've got a long track, well, maybe getting some trees for shade along the track. So when they're walking home, they're just not overheated just from the act of coming from the field into the parlour. And we know from urban research, tarmac in an urban setting can be 50 degrees warm. And when you put a tree in that landscape, it can reduce that temperature down to 20 degrees. It's a massive difference. So your cows coming into being milked, they're kind of, well, I remember one farmer telling me, that when his cows came in, they were just floppy. And then if you offer them shade, they're not floppy anymore.
No, and that's a massive degree difference, isn't it, between having shade and not when they're walking back. So you can see how they'd very quickly get heat stressed. I know from my own personal experience of walking on a concrete path in the sun, it's very, very hot. But when it's shady with trees, it's much more comfortable. So you can imagine
Yeah,
how the cows feel as well.
yeah, yeah, that's right. And a mile can feel like 10 if you're too hot and uncomfortable.
Yeah, definitely. We've actually had a question from Casper Holmes on willow, and can browsing on willow stems provide some of the same benefits as the summer willow foliage? Is the question.
Yes. Well, it can do. Of course, none of these responses are simple. Of course, they're not. And there's a huge amount of work to do on research still in terms of tree fodder. To get a better handle on some of this, I've actually delved a little bit into bioremediation research, because some of the trees, all plants have different strategies, and some of the trees are hyper accumulators of certain things. So, as I said, willow is always high in zinc because they're an accumulator of zinc. So, willows have been researched extensively in terms of bioremediation. So this is where I come on to the response. Their research, because they want to know if they're capturing effectively these chemical pollution, they want to know what time of year is the best time to harvest that pollution. And so they looked at the levels of zinc in willow across the summer in the stems, in the bark, and in the leaves. And what they find is during the summer, a lot of the zinc goes to the leaf. But when it gets to the autumn and the leaves are starting to senesce, the zinc actually travels back into the
Mm.
tree. So whether that happens with other chemicals and other nutrients, I don't know. But there's some evidence to indicate that at least with zinc, that eating the bark would be beneficial. But we do know that animals will strip bark, and it might be that it is actively an attractive thing to do at times, but it might also be because it's better than nothing, you know. But
Yeah, so it
there's
sounds like
so
there's a
much
bit
more
of
to do.
research needed on, yeah, if it's at the time of year that, so in the summer it's let's eat the leaves, but in the autumn we start moving on to the bark and the stems of the willow instead, and that actually is a
Yeah,
better source of nutrients then.
yeah, that's right. And of course, you then have the complication of sap, and we as humans, we also harvest sap. So birch sap, maple syrup, obvious. So it might be that's the attractant. Um,
Yeah, which you couldn't really blame them then if, if that, they wanted something a little bit sugary then.
Absolutely
Um,
not. No.
No, and you kind of touched on tannins earlier, but I think there probably are some concerns around kind of the levels of tannins, particularly in the autumn around acorn season. Um, and just wondering what we can do to prevent them eating too many. Is there a reason why they might glut themselves? Is that a kind of nutrient deficiency, or what's the kind of going on there if you know, and just kind of giving a bit of advice on that side of things as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of things going on. Um, it's not a one size fits all response, of course. So we let's say the animals have got two mountains to climb, if you like, in terms of acorns. The first one is that it's not a master every year. So they don't learn in the same way. Let's say, for example, you go to the Dehesa. It's a master every year in the Dehesa, and they rely on that to feed and fatten their pigs. I should also say that the levels of tannins are different in different oaks as well, and there are some oaks that are being bred for low tannin for this purpose, actually for that purpose, but also for food for humans, because we used
Mhm.
to eat acorn flour as well in the past. The other mountain they've got to climb is that most of our farmed animals learn what is a food source from their mothers. And we often break that relationship in two ways, either by having a landscape that's no longer very enriched,
Mhm.
or by removing the calf from the mother and rearing them in separate fields. So they've lost a lot of that learning in lots of ways. I mean, that said, when you have a windfall of something and which might taste nice and you don't understand the consequences of it, then you start to get into these periods of risk. And clearly, acorns sit in that category for our animals. So, if we think to the New Forest, when there's been a mast year and there aren't enough pigs in the New Forest, then you certainly get cattle and horse deaths. On the flip side, though, if you look at transhumance farming systems, um, the farmers will actively take all of their animals to go and feed on the acorns, but they manage their intake.
Mm.
So in our systems, for most years, it's not a problem. But when it becomes a mast year, then I think really the sensible thing to do is to either fence off those areas or
Yeah.
to try to keep the stock out of those fields for that period of time.
Hmm.
Um, and I think back to when my mum was a child, and she used to be sent out. She would pick acorns. She would actually harvest acorns, and she'd get a penny a sack for the farmer down the road with pigs. And I'm not suggesting we go back to that point, but I suppose the point I'm making is that our relationship with the landscape is different to the way it once was. And in the past, this would have been seen as a resource, not as a risk factor. Yeah,
I guess that's another kind of added benefit of those kind of mixed livestock systems, isn't it, where things follow each other. Yeah, because you're removing some of the risk then by having the pigs maybe go into the field ahead of the
yeah,
cows and eating a lot of the acorns
yes,
at the time. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But
Um,
it's sorry, only just to say it's worth remembering, that oak trees have such a long relationship with pasture, and it's really about management, isn't it, rather than them not
mhm.
being there.
Yeah, definitely. I think probably everybody enjoys seeing oak trees in the landscape as well. We've sort of talked about some of the trade-offs a little bit, but it'd be good to kind of touch a bit more on some of those trade-offs when we're thinking about trees and their placement and things as well. You've spoken about the kind of four different types of considerations when you're putting in kind of shelter belts or where you're planting trees. But I'm just thinking around water availability and stock kind of choices around staying in the shade or going to get water. So wonder if you could just touch on some of those aspects as well.
Yeah, so we've got if I focus a little bit on cattle here, then as a behavior scientist, we sort of lump their behaviors into different categories, if you like. So we've got what we call contagious behaviors and non-contagious behaviors. So the contagious behaviors are grazing and resting. And you'll typically find once animals break from a resting bout and then they'll go off and graze, then one animal grazing typically starts to pull all the animals to graze. And that's, it makes a lot of sense from the animal's point of view. If you're a prey animal and your vision is already not very good, if you're head down, then it makes sense that you're doing it as a group
Yeah,
rather than an isolated animal. So that's what we call a contagious behavior. Um, a non-contagious behavior is drinking. So thirst is an individual thing. The challenge with thirst is that the pull to stay with the herd can be stronger than the need to quench thirst. And so if the water tank is too far away, then the animal is very reluctant to leave the herd. So some work that I did a few years ago, I've not published it, but I followed a herd around and I followed their willingness to go and drink. And that seems to be around the 30-meter mark. So as the cows were moving around the field and they would come close to a water trough, the cows would peel off one by one, and they almost gave themselves the space to drink individually at the trough. But as soon as they moved away from that 30 meters, then no cows were then drinking. The challenge with when you're thinking about drinking and shade, so we talk about different strategies as well, evolutionary stable strategies. So they're effectively the cheapest in terms of energy, the cheapest thing to do to keep the status quo. And so if an animal is stressed thermally, so it's too hot, then shade is a very clear, stable strategy. But if you need water as well, then you start to have this tussle, if you like. And so if the water is too far away from the shade, the cost to go to the water is so great that they give up on the shade. So you might think that the shade is not important. It is, but the animal is now weighing up its cost to its health. And so
Mm.
it's going to hang around the water source instead. And that's why you get animals bunching around a water source. Um, and they might do that anyway when there's shade available, but then go and look at the shade and see what else is going on. Is it that it's got biting flies in there? So there's another thing to think about, another thing that they're trading off. In terms of flies, most of the problem flies that we have are peripheral woodland. So if the animals have access to get in amongst the trees, then they are less worried by them.
Hmm.
But it's starting to read these landscapes, and the other strategy that cattle have, um, apart from the shelter and the water, is to go and find a place in the field where the airflow is greatest. So you might see them, for example, I don't know, on a bank where the airflow is higher. Now here they'll still have the solar radiation, but the lived experience of the temperature will still be cooler.
Because the air's flowing around them more, so they're maintaining a kind of lower body temperature again.
Yeah, yeah. And of course that might help with my issue as well, at least with the
Mm.
midges. You know, midges would really struggle to control their flight in those scenarios. But I think the thing to think about, with flies is that yes, trees do attract flies, but they're not exclusive to the trees either. And I've seen plenty of cattle out in the middle of a field, all bunched up really tightly, trying to keep the flies off their faces. So they're really getting the best of all worlds, sorry, the worst of all worlds in this scenario. So they're being bothered by the flies. Um, they're hot because it's a hot day, and then they're multiplying that heat by keeping each other close. So they're actually
Mm.
increasing their heat load. Um, yeah. So yes, they're associated with trees, but they're not exclusive to trees. Um, and I don't know
Does
if I've,
infield trees, do they, so if you had multiple infield trees, kind of a silver pasture system, is that a better way of kind of spreading the fly risk as well?
oh, well, yes, it is, because if you're talking about a well-designed silvopastoral system, you're also talking about habitat, not just habitat for the livestock, but habitat for the rest of the ecological system. So we're thinking about bringing birds in, which act as predators for the aerial flies, but also increasing activity at soil level. So a piece of research that I came across looking at dung beetles in silvopastoral systems compared to open pasture, you find more species of dung beetle. I remember this because it's all 40%. It's a nice piece of research to remember, but there are more species of dung beetle, and there are 40% greater numbers, and they are 40% more active than dung beetles on open pasture. And very neatly, this piece of research looked at head flies in both systems. And even though more flies are being bred, if you like, in the
Mm.
silvopastoral system, when you take a head count, there were 40% fewer head flies in the silvopastoral system because you put the predators back in.
Mm.
So it can tolerate it. When you start to rebuild the ecological landscape, then that tolerance level is also greater. So the animals are actually doing better, even though more flies are hatching, or
Yeah.
eggs, more flies, eggs are being laid, if you like.
Yeah, so it's just that greater resilience of the whole system or
Yes.
overall. So yeah, you've got more space for your animals to take shelter, you've got more natural predation, and you're
Yeah.
kind of spreading them out as well, so they're not all kind of standing together and
Yeah.
increasing the risk as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I suppose, in some ways, we've got some diseases such as New Forest eye, which is related to insects and trees. And when they're rubbing their eyes, maybe they're not all using the same tree to rub their eyes on and infecting others in the herd. Um, And I know it's a challenge with this because there are a few diseases such as New Forest eye where they have to be exposed to it to develop resistance.
Mm.
And I guess that's the challenge and the balance, isn't it, with all of these systems?
Yeah, there's always going to be, as we said, trade-offs, and there's never going to be a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. But I think, yeah, improving resilience overall and all of the kind of wider benefits that you've mentioned in terms of the kind of economic impact on the farm as well, from kind of loss of production and everything else, and also not being as reliant on external inputs, which we know are going to get more and
Yeah.
more costly with current situations. Yeah, I think it's just always beneficial, isn't it? So if we don't have any more questions from the audience, maybe I'll wrap us up a tiny bit early so everybody can go off and have their tea and things. But if
Did
people,
Ian, sorry,
oh,
did Ian
sorry,
manage to ask his question?
no, he didn't. So I don't know whether Ian does want to type something in the chat or in the question Q&A box. Um, if not, Ian, do feel free to kind of email the NFFN info box and we'll see if we can get a response out to you that way. But while we're on that subject, if people are interested in hearing more about Shade and Shelter for Livestock Health and Welfare, where can they go for more information? I think Kath has very handily posted something in the chat around the tree fodder guide, but I know that you're speaking at other events later this year, so I'll hand over to you to let them know where they can find out more.
Yeah, well, I suppose the biggie is Groundswell coming up in July, where we are definitely, I say we, the Woodland Trust is organising this session, but we're going to expand on this um, topic of understanding the landscape. So we talk a lot about putting things back into the landscape for the animals, but how do they see it? Just because it's there, is it there in the right form or in the right place, if you like? So we're gonna be looking at that. Um, yeah, I don't know if this is of interest for the farmers in the call, but I've actually been talking to some vets and we've been developing some material for vets to better understand these systems as well, to try to give better support from the animal health angle. So these narratives are better supported across all groups engaged, with good animal welfare at the farm level. So even though they're going to be closed training, then the idea is that they provide better support for these more natural systems.
No, that sounds ideal. I think that it's really important that everybody kind of gets educated, and it's not just for farmers to be advising their vets. It's really important that vets also understand how the systems work and why a farmer might be making certain choices and how they can help support that in terms of what they're doing on farm as well, with the animals' health and welfare in mind too.
Yeah, completely. I was really minded. I was doing a session at ORFC about the use of alternative treatments for fly strike, um, and I was hearing that farmers were getting a bit sick of hearing this toolbox, because they said there's never anything in it. So, and I'm really mindful of that because I think it's still a really good way of thinking because we don't have any silver bullets, and when we've tried to go down the silver bullet route, we've always made a mess of it. We're ending up with resistance, negative consequences of that approach. So I think the toolbox approach is right, but I'm now also very conscious that we need to start filling it.
Mm.
Um, and so hopefully, having more vets on board considering these alternative approaches will speed that process up a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that'll be really useful for farmers as well, because it's always nice to know there are some solutions coming down the line or that they're being better advocated for if there are kind of some solutions out there, even if they're not the silver bullet that everyone's hoping for.
Yeah, sure.
Well, on that note, it's been a really great conversation, such an interesting talk, an interesting evening. I hope everybody who has attended the webinar has enjoyed it as well. As I said, anyone that's got any further questions, either if you're coming to Groundswell, go and join the session in the agroforestry tent there. But hopefully you all feel like leaving with a broad knowledge on the valuable role of trees infield and hedgerows in offering a source of shade and shelter and fodder for livestock. You've got better clarity on the how and why behind stock behaviour in different weather conditions kind of changes, and then also a clearer understanding of how simple changes to shade, shelter and browse opportunities can support good animal health and welfare and productivity. Yeah, thank you very much for attending, and hopefully see some of you at Groundswell and at our further webinar in this series, looking at drought in arable cropping systems. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a nice evening.